So last night, I thought it best to look over tonight's lesson since I was well prepared for it last Wednesday, and then I hadn't really thought about it anymore. It's a good thing I did because the scripture reading was the story of Nicodemus. And I thought, oh, well, we pretty much covered that on Sunday night. We don't need to read that again. And so I thought, well, let me find something that sort of jives with what it is. And so I looked, and there was a reference to Ezekiel chapter 34. So we read Ezekiel chapter 34. I hope you gained a lot from it. I don't know that it jives really well at all, but nonetheless, that's what we did. You need to go to John chapter 9. And I told Dad I only wanted to sing one song because we are going to be covering all of John chapter 9. So, like sometimes we've had all these short readings. It's all the chickens are coming home to roost tonight, because we're going to have the full one. You'll be home by midnight, I hope. So, but we're talking about tonight, the man born blind. And realistically, we're covering all of chapter 9, but there's really 3 different lessons sort of within it. And it wasn't feasible to sort of break it down because I feel like we would have left out part of it. John chapter 9 is divided into 3 parts. And the first part will be the miracle. The first part is the man who was born blind who will be healed. The second part, though, deals with, and a story that probably many of you are familiar with, the Pharisees' complaints about Jesus, but also the boy's parents sort of worried about their status within the temple as well. And then the last part, because Jesus does not speak in the middle part. And then the last part, the end of it, is where Jesus will sort of drive home the point. The miracle will already be over. And so for some of these that we've talked about here over the last few weeks when we've been talking about this, sometimes the miracle happens at the end, sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's early. Tonight it'll be early, and then it will be a little bit more. We have a lot to read. I've tried to break it down to somewhat shorter readings, but I appreciate any participation for all of you all that's doing that might read, and I'll call on you and make sure we get everybody involved. I want to start though with a sort of discussion point that will emerge in this lesson, and that is the source of suffering. And that's a question that's hard to answer for us today, and it was hard to answer for people back then. All of you have probably heard the statement uttered, why do bad things happen to good people? What's the answer to that question? I don't know, because bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. So it's really hard to answer that question. And there have been philosophers that have written countless books trying to answer that, but they don't really solve the problem. And for us, you might say, well, that solved her problem, but it didn't really seem to solve mine. So maybe you agreed with it, but I disagreed with it. But that's a question that has sort of always existed. And that will be a major point for us tonight. And so what we're going to be looking at, Jesus is leaving the temple in Jerusalem one Sabbath day, and he passes by a man who had been blind since birth. So we'll set the stage there. First of all, it's the Sabbath day. We've addressed this quite often, but what will the Pharisees say that Jesus should not be doing on the Sabbath day? Shouldn't be healing, because they had limited the things that you could do. But you're walking past a man who had been blind since birth. And that's the kind of person that probably could really use a healing. Tom, I think about you when I was thinking about this, kind of getting ready. You've got to have cataract surgery here in a couple weeks. But you only a couple weeks ago woke up being unable to see. And our faith and trust is that in a couple weeks, you'll be back to normal. You'll be able to drive and you won't be able to see around corners anymore. But nonetheless, it'll all be good, right? But I'm not as worried about Tom because you've spent a long time with vision, but this is a man who had been blind since birth. And that is a really bad thing for this young man. And so the disciples, the people that are following Jesus, they ask him who had sinned, the man or his parents, causing him to be born blind? Now, we'll get into that question a little bit more here in a few moments. But this is a question that sometimes we ask, not necessarily verbatim, but when something bad happens, we sometimes ask the question, what did I do that caused this? What have I done? I can't think of anything that I've done wrong to cause this, but we battle that around in our heads just a little bit. The Jews assumed that all calamities, including disease and suffering, were the results of either your own sins or those of your parents. And so that was where sort of the blame would get placed. And we'll see all of that a little bit more in just a second. Jewish beliefs regarding punishment for sins. And there's a couple of pictures up here. And we'll talk about pictures in a second. There was a belief that certain sins cause certain calamities or diseases. There's a couple of examples right here. Samson was blinded because his eyes lusted after Delilah. Well, that's how the story was told, right? But, those kinds of things, you might say, how many of you, this may be crazy, but sometimes you get these little white marks on your fingernails. Mom always told us it's because we lied. Well, I highly doubt that's true, but I can't prove that it's false. And every time I looked, but every time I looked at that, my first thought was, did I say something wrong? Yes. Well, I like Maria a lot better than Mom right here. So Maria said that she was always told that meant you were going to get a present. Hers is a lot better. It's from hitting your, but we tell those kind of things, they sort of become sort of the reason why. But the reason we tell those kind of stories is because we don't really know what the reason would be. The second one, Absalom was hanged when his hair got caught in the tree because he was proud of his hair. Well, that was the story that was told. I don't know, your hair is long. Those of you that have long hair, you've probably got it caught in something. Kevin, this ain't a problem that we can't really relate to this right here. But sometimes we look for an explanation for why something happened. How many times do you ride by on the horse and your hair not get caught in the tree? Well, probably 100 times. But the one time it happens, this always happens to me, right? We look for a blame of some reason for it. And disease and suffering, yes, are both results of sin in the world, but the commission of sin is not always followed by a disease. We know that. We know people that do wrong their whole life. Nothing ever seems to happen to them, right? And then a specific sin does not necessarily produce a specific affliction, right? We know people that maybe have done things and seem to get by with it. And so the point of this is that there was this sort of cultural belief that somebody had done specifically wrong and they're being punished as a result of it. I think we kind of like that because we want to know why things happen, and we want to know that if somebody does something wrong, they get in trouble for it, right? Any other thoughts on this? And we may see some more in just a minute, but anybody want to throw anything out before we go further? All right. So the responsibility of sin, bear with me. Some Jews believe that it was possible to sin before birth. This is a Christian thinking that still exists as well, this notion of original sin, that you're born with sin as well. That still does sort of exist. Another basic belief was that the sins of the parents are visited upon the children. Well, we'll get to that in a second. But in Ezekiel chapter 18, we read, "The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." I don't suspect this is going to happen, but if Dad goes out and robs a bank after church tonight, they're not going to come and arrest me. They might call me in for questioning. Is there a reason why he did it? Was he with you at church? Whatever it might be. But if he robbed the bank, that's the sin of him. I'm not going to get in trouble for that. And so what we see there in Ezekiel, the wicked will have to answer for the wickedness. The righteousness will be credited, maybe we would say, for the righteousness. But each person is responsible for his own sins. And so that's where we're going to be tonight. The question of this person that's blind, did someone sin to cause his blindness? If so, who did it? And if it's not the fault of anybody, where does Jesus and his teachings come in for that? So we're going to try and address several things here this evening. Our picture for tonight is the healing of a man born blind from way back in 1567. This is El Greco, who is one of the most famous Spanish artists from the Spanish Golden Period, but he's not actually Spanish. He was from Greece, which is why it's called El Greco. That's Spanish for the Greek. His last name ends in O-U-S, and there's probably 8,000 letters in front of it there as well, but a very famous artist there as well. So again, we're going to be in John chapter 9. Going from 1 through 41, but we'll divide it up and we will ask a few questions and discuss here as we go. Let's start with verses 1 through 7. Mom, do you care to read this?
Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, that this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me. And while it is day, the night is coming, and no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the man with the clay. And he said to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sin. So he went and washed and came back saying,
Says maybe not the perfect place to stop, but it's where I want to stop for us right now. So we get almost immediately, we get the question. We see the blind man. We see that it's the Sabbath. We get the question posed to Jesus, and Jesus gives an answer, and then Jesus will start the miracle. We'll see a little bit more of it in just a second. But let's talk about, first of all, in its most simplest form, what do we know after one verse is wrong with this man? He's blind, okay? And he's not only just blind, Maria, what did you say there, dude? He's blind from birth. So he's got a plight that he's had to deal with his entire life. We know that from the get-go. And so the disciples seeing this man, but undoubtedly they've seen other blind people. And this question, in a way, sort of serves as a proxy for all these other ailments that have befallen people on this journey, because we're on like lesson 26. What question did the disciples ask in verse 2? Okay, so they say rabbi, which translates to teacher, right? And so they're asking Jesus, and Jesus was referred to as rabbi quite a bit, but you're saying teacher. When you ask the teacher something, you're hoping to get a response in return. But they give Jesus the question, they say rabbi or teacher, who sinned? But it doesn't stop there. They assign the answer as either A or B, right? They say, who sinned? What was the first option? This man. So that's A, or B, it was who else? His parents. So they have assumed then that someone has sinned, and they've either said, who was it? The man or his parents. So the question is already a loaded question because they're already saying there's a reason for it. If I were to say, who is the president of the United States? Well, we can assume from my question that there is a president, right? Now we're just trying to figure out who that person would be. Well, that's what they're asking here. So the assumption from the get-go is that somebody sinned. Let's go a little further. Jesus said, neither the man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. He must work the works of God while it was blank. What's that first blank should be? While it was day, for while he was in the world, he was the blank of the world. Light. Now, this does not mean 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But what does this statement mean by Jesus? First of all, let's go to the first part. Neither the man nor his parents sinned. What is Jesus saying right there?
That clears that up once and for all.
So the apostles' question was the question was wrong from the get-go. But Jesus could have said, neither the man or his parents sinned, period, and stopped. But that would have left a lot of more questions, because that doesn't really answer the question at all. Well, if I told you that neither the man nor his parents sinned and I stopped, what's your next question? Well, then who did? I mean, okay, so it's C, the other option, right? None of the above, but who was it? But Jesus doesn't stop there. He continues by saying, but instead it would allow what to happen? Allow Jesus to perform this miracle. Now, that may not serve as a great answer to the question, but what Jesus is really saying right here is there are people that need help, and it is going to be our responsibility to help them. This man is blind. Other people have had withered arms. Other people have had demons, but other people are just facing troubles that come across them every single day. And Jesus says, we're going to do this right now, because the back half, John chapter 9 and verse 5, he said, we're going to do it while it's day. That doesn't mean it's daylight outside. What's Jesus saying? We're going to do it while it's day. While he was there. Because he says, once I'm gone, it's not going to happen. I know the apostles would have that ability, but it was this is, again, the miracle's purpose was to do what? To confirm the works, to show that Jesus was the Son of God. It was an opportunity. So I know that we haven't healed the man yet. I stopped there on purpose, but I want to look at the last question that's up there. What was Jesus's methods of healing, or method of healing, and what instructions does he give to the man? Let's go into verses 6 and 7 here to start with. What method does Jesus use? Okay. So after he had talked to them, he spits on the ground, makes a little clay with the saliva there. He anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Now, we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we talked about the man with that couldn't hear. But he does this, and so we see what he's done. This, again, doesn't seem super medical, but what it definitely was there was an action being performed by Jesus. But then he puts it on the man and tells the man what? What instructions did he give him? He says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. So this is a two-part thing. Jesus does his part, but what does the man have to do? If Jesus could have done that and the man could have just walked on home, well, that's not what Jesus had asked him to do. Now, does every miracle done by Jesus follow this same pattern? No. There are many times that we've seen Jesus doesn't require anything of the miracle receiver. But this time he does. He does his part, and he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And what did the man do? He went and did that. All right. So let's go a little further here. Kevin, this is John 9. Do you care to read verses 8 through 12? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Uh-huh. Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. Sure.
And I think that gives us a better image. If we could see his feet would have been dirty.
Mm-hmm.
That's from the story. It's a rocky, dirty area.
Right. Right.
He's been thin and gaunt a lot of the time.
Yeah.
He never ate like he should. I think it helps us identify Jesus a little bit. Oh, he's this princely prince around with blowing robes and all this.
Yeah.
There's none of that ever.
So just a,
Spitting on the ground.
right.
Making mud.
Just the way, maybe think about it this way. Go this evening or go tomorrow and put shorts and a t-shirt, maybe no shoes, and go to the Little League baseball park and walk from home plate to first to second to third and home and see how dirty your feet are when you've went, that'll be 240 feet, I guess, all the way around a Little League park. You will have walked 240 feet, and most of y'all will need 2 showers after you're done. You'll feel like you're so dirty, right? Well, imagine now walking around everywhere all the time. You're exactly right. And so this, like you said, this action that is done, you know, they're kind of in the dirt. They're kind of getting a little bit a little dirty here. Kevin, go ahead. John 9, this is verse 8 through 12.
Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, "Is not this he who saith and they?" Some said, "This is he." Others said, "He is like him." He said, "I am he." Therefore they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" He answered and said, "The man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed, and I received sight." Then they said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
All right. So we see what before what Kevin just read, we saw what Jesus had done, and he said, "Go and wash." And so now the neighbors start to ask a few questions, right? In John 9, verses 8 and 9, what did the neighbors and the other people say about this man? Is this the guy that was blind? Is this the guy that sat and begged, like you said there, Lucille? And some of them in verse 9 said, well, it's him. And others said, you know, we can translate, well, he's a lot like him, but I don't know. When they asked the man how his eyes were opened, what did the man tell them? All right. So if we go back to verse 9, they said, well, this is he, and well, it sure looks a whole lot like him. And he responded by saying, no, I'm him. I am him. And so they have a follow-up question. Verse 10, I guess I probably should have put that up there. The follow-up question for them was, well, what happened, right? Weren't you blind? Like, didn't you used to be blind is the question that's presented there. And he said, what? Now, Lucille, I've kind of stepped over your question, so I answer it again. What did he say? All right. So he tells them literally word for word what happened. Now I like verse 12 here, because verse 12 is the exact answer that everybody else would have probably given as well. Verse 12, they said, well, where is he? Now, you can look at that one of two different ways. You know, I slept on his shoulder wrong. It'd be nice he could maybe help me out. But there might also be some from the Pharisee side. It's like, let's go see, you know, there could be some violation of the Sabbath day going on here as well. But what's interesting is how the man responds. Did he have any idea where Jesus was? He doesn't seem to know who Jesus was. He gave a description, sort of word for word, of what happened. But then he says, I don't know where he went. Which tells me then, when Jesus told him to go and wash, he had to go at least some distance to a pool of Siloam. I don't know where it was compared to where they were, but it was at least some distance. And when he had done that, he was healed, right? He didn't have to report back to Jesus and Jesus rubbed the dirt off of him. He was healed right there, all right? And so now the question is going to be, well, should this happen? Should this be allowed, perhaps? So we've done the miracle. So we're going to stop with the miracle there. And now we're going to get into a sort of legal debate, a religious debate about whether this should or should not have happened. All right. Tony, do you care to read these verses? John 9, 13 to 17. All right. So if we want to look at verses 8 through 12 as sort of the crowd response, verses 13 through 17 is sort of the legal response. Okay. What will the religious leaders have to say? What would the law have to say? And when I say law here, these are the followers of the law of Moses. Remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about how that, Rome didn't really have any say in the law right here. As long as you did what you're supposed to do, they wouldn't have cared who was necessarily being healed. But the question comes up. The people bring the man to the Pharisees and they ask how he received his sight. The man gives a simple answer. What does he say? What did the man respond in verses 13 through 15? Yep. He put the clay on my eyes, I wash, and I see. Now, this is the third time we've seen this, right? And it's the same story every time. So the man is not lying or fibbing or making it up. He's told the same story every single time. Now, what controversy then arises in verse 16? What caused people to take what should have obviously been a pretty joyous situation and become an argument? Verse 16, it was done. Well, verse 14, I guess it was on the Sabbath, but verse 16 is where it comes up. And the controversy was this is done on the Sabbath. And they sort of split into two camps right here. What were the two camps that they split into in verse 16?
One saying it can't be from God because he healed on the Sabbath.
All right, stop there for a second. So we have the first camp that says, this man can't be from God because he's healing on the Sabbath, and you don't do that because you would be in violation of God's law. Are they right? They kind of are, right? On the Sabbath, they had these sort of restrictions as to what they could do. And so there's a valid argument for what they're saying. But then, what's the back half of verse 16's argument say? Yep. Well, if he's from God, he can't be a sinner. We'll assume that. But if he is a sinner, you wouldn't be able to heal this man. So it's almost like, well, by the letter of the law, yeah, he is breaking it, but he's doing something that none of us can do. So they're sort of split there, right? They both have a valid argument based on sort of their own belief. Now, this is where we fall into traps today. Sometimes we get a little legalistic, but this is where the old law suffered from a lack of grace. Okay? By law, Jesus had done wrong. But if Jesus had followed the law, what would happen to the man? And it's hard to say I'm a healing and comforting God who loves all people, and I have a chance to heal this guy and I don't. So we have this controversy, this conflict that arises among both. Yes. Right. Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So after they've seemed to argue about it a little bit, they both made their case, they turn around and ask the guy who had been healed. He's sort of the star of the show, right? So what did they ask him in verse 17? They asked him, what do you think of the person who healed you? And how does he respond? He is a prophet. Okay? He said, he is a prophet. Well, whose side is he on right there? He's just, again, telling them what happened. Because there were prophets of the old law, so this side's right. But there was also grace here that this man has healed him, so he's right as well. So we've not really solved anything yet. Fortunately, we've got about 30 more verses, so we can go through those right here. John 9:18 to 23. Lucille, do you care to read that? On down to 23. All right. Thank you, ma'am. All right. So now let's go. We're going to go ask mom and dad, right? And now we're, the principal's calling home, as it were, right here to figure out what it is. Well, the Jews we see here, my questions are a little longer. I apologize for that. But they didn't believe that the man had been blind until they called his parents and questioned them. Now, his parents, of anybody, who's going to know that the kid is blind? Parents. They're absolutely going to know that he's blind. And this is not he was blinded, a couple days ago. He was blind since birth. All right. So if anybody knows, mom and dad are going to know. And so when they called the parents, I say called, I feel like I rung them up, rotary phoned them. What was the response of the parents? This is our son. He was born blind. So again, they've answered the question. Now, later then, we see, in verse 21, but by what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. Now, they answered, yes, he was blind. But they almost already know what the follow-up question is going to be, right? The follow-up question is going to be what? Who did it? And so in order to accurately answer that, they're probably going to make who mad? The Pharisees. And there's something that goes along with it. Why did they say he was old enough to answer the questions himself in verse 22 and 23? All right. We see in verse 22, they said that the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the temple. And the temple, we said, was what? That was the focal point of their life. That was the town square, as it were, where everything sort of happened, not just religiously, but business happened there. That's where commerce, that's where interactions, that's where courting would have happened. All of that would have happened right there. And they said, you can ask him. He can get kicked out of the temple, but not us. What do you think about this response from the parents? They don't seem to have his back. What else might we? He was old enough. Uh-huh. They did.
They told us what was asked. They answered what was asked of them, and then they were not there. So ask him, he's not there.
Right. Right. Kevin? Right. Maybe so. It's. They really, sometimes sometimes we know things and we don't say things, right? It's what was it Lincoln that said, better to keep your mouth shut rather than reveal yourself a fool, something like that. And so it's almost as if they knew the answer here, but they were sort of guarding themselves. They were protecting themselves from it. Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. Right. Right. You know what?
They're not taking sides.
You know what seems weird? We've read from verses 13 all the way down to verse 23, and nobody seems super impressed that a blind man is able to see. Now, verses 1 through 12, people were pretty impressed, right? But you remember who was in verses 1 through 12? The citizens, right? Just the everyday people. But when it becomes sort of the legal issue, wow, that's not what we're worried about. We're following the law right there. Let's go a little further. Linda Denham, do you care to read this one? This is John 9, 24 to 27. Okay. Now, the level of frustration ratchets up a little bit in this set of verses right here. So the Jews then called the son before them because mom and dad said he's old enough. So they call him in. They've already talked to him, but they call him in again. And they said, and what did they tell him in John 9 and verse 24? Now, think about that statement for a second. They said, give God the glory. We know this, that there is a level of sarcasm that it's dripping off the page in that statement right there. At this point, I'll go ahead and skip to the question because we'll see the man's answer. But I think the man gets a little offended right here because you're almost making a joke about the fact that I've lived my entire life unable to see. And now I've been healed and nobody seems excited that I can see, but instead we're sort of mocking the guy who actually healed me. How does the man respond in verse 25?
I just could imagine the little man thinking, I don't care if he's a sinner or not. I don't care what he was.
Yeah.
I don't care if he was the worst person in the world. I am saved.
That's literally the answer to that question, right? He says, I don't know if he's a sinner or not, but he says the most important thing in verse 25, I don't know, but only thing I know is what? What he's really saying is all I know is this morning I couldn't see you, now I can.
And you tell them the same thing.
Yes.
And, it's kind of like, well, how many more times do I say it?
Absolutely. So he's asked then once again how he had been healed, and he says, I've already told you, but what? You're not listening, or maybe you don't want to hear, maybe however you want to say it like that. But he throws a little something else on the end there in verse 27. And what was that? He kind of puts the ball back in their court. He says, well, I can tell it again. We can kind of interpret it like, do you want me to say it again? It sounds like you're wanting to you need to know a little more about him, right? Well, that's the last thing the Pharisees probably wanted to hear from him right there. All right. So now we've went from the man healed to a legal sort of lawyerly debate to now the man is frustrated with them. But whose side is the man on? Clearly, he's on Jesus' side 100% right here. Let's go a little further. Boo, this is John 9:28 to 34. All right. Now let's look at our questions right here. First of all, how did the Pharisees react to this? I've got 4 things right up here from John 9:28 and 29. First of all, they what? What does that word mean, to revile? Talked ugly. In a sense, you just hated this guy, right? A little bit right there. They reviled him. And then we see you are what? You are his disciples. And he said, they're in a sense, they're saying, look, we realize you're following this guy. They're talking about Jesus. In a sense, they're saying, this con man, this snake oil salesman, we realize you're out here following him. But the third part says, we are whose disciples? Pharisees said, we are Moses' disciples. And what they are really saying is, we are right and you are wrong, and you're going to have to get yourself figured out so you can get back over here on our side. We talked Sunday night that Jesus said that the scribes and Pharisees, they sat on Moses' seat, right? Jesus revered them in the sense of their position. They had given their life to following the law. But we see there, the last one, we know blank spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we don't know where he's from. We know God spoke to Moses. So the man told the Jews that God does not hear whom? So he doesn't hear sinners, but he'll hear who? People who worship him, okay? Take it a little bit further. Since the world began, what had never happened? So what this is saying, and Jesus has healed people, but what this man is saying is we've never had anybody come through that could do this. He's saying since the beginning of time, if you was born blind, you out of luck. However long you live, that's just how long it's going to have to be. He said, since the beginning of time, nobody has ever done this. And so what was the conclusion of the healed man in verse 33? Okay, so he says, if this man were not of God, he could do nothing. So you remember in Joshua, was it Joshua 24 and verse 15, I think, where he says, y'all can serve the gods on the other side of the river. But Joshua says, as for me and my house, we'll what? We'll say, what's this man sort of repeating right there? In a sense, he's saying, look, I know y'all are on Moses' seat. I know y'all are the law, but none of y'all healed me and this guy did. I'm going to ride with this guy rather than this person over here. Now, the Jewish leaders will respond the way that all of us will be able to relate to. In verse 34, how did they respond to the man's conclusion? You're born in sin. You're acting like you're so smart. You're trying to teach us. Nah, you're out. We're right and you're wrong. How many of you have ever said something to the effect of, I'm right and you're wrong, and that's the end of it? Or I'm your mom. That's why I'm right. Something like that. We've probably all heard, because I said so. You ever heard that one? We all know. What is the purpose of because I said so? You need to shut up, all right? You need to hush. We're done with this conversation. Well, in a sense, what the Pharisees are saying is we've walked 34 verses right here, and we ain't walking any further. You're out. But does that answer the question that was posed at the beginning of our lesson tonight? Verse 2, maybe it's verse 3, verse 2, the disciples asked what at the very beginning? Who sinned? Did we get an answer to that question from both sides? We really don't get an answer to that question because it's not there's not an answer to it. There's really not. All right, let's go the last little bit. John 9, 35 to 41. Maria, do you care to read this one, dear? Okay. Now let's go home with this last little bit. Jesus is noticeably absent from verses 13 to 34. Jesus is clearly around because he's in verses 1 to 12 and he's in verses 35 to 41. Sometimes you sometimes just want to sit back and let them argue amongst themselves a little bit. And I think maybe we see Jesus do that because it's almost as if Jesus is, I don't presume to think like Jesus, but this is an argument that's probably existed for a long time. I don't know if we can fix this one or not. But Jesus hears that the Jews had cast the man out. Jesus is sort of out of the picture, but back in. He finds the man. That's interesting, right? He finds the man and he asks him what in John 9:35? What does Jesus ask him? He didn't say, did they cast you out, right? Jesus, where's the temple talk from Jesus right here? Not nothing, right? Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of God? It's a good starting question, right? The man answers him how in verse 36? Who is he, Lord, right? That I may believe in him. So it's not a matter that he doesn't believe. And I think this man is kind of hearing it for the first time. But he knows sort of what's happened, right? Jesus then identifies himself in verse 37. And in verse 38, what did the man say and do? Well, Jesus said in verse 37, he says, you've both seen him and he is who you are talking with right now. The man says what? Lord, I believe, and worship him. He was straddling the fence of believing. He just needed to get a little confirmation, right? What was the purpose of the miracles? To confirm who Jesus was. Did it work? Now, it worked for the man who seemed to want to see it. The Pharisees didn't seem as interested in it as what the man did. Jesus then said he came into the world for judgment and mentioned two classes of people. He said, those who do not see may what? Those may be able to see, and those who see may become what? What does that mean? What is Jesus saying right there? I don't think Jesus is talking about the blind guy right here. He's not talking about blind people at all. But he's talking about people that were spiritually blind, right? He's saying that this man woke up this morning and couldn't see, but he was prepared to believe who God was, and he could see. Well, in many cases, we're like that, right? What's the song? I once was lost in sin, but Jesus took me in. Then a little light from heaven filled my soul. That's how that song goes. Now let's have a little talk with Jesus, right? And so he is saying that this guy couldn't see, but he was searching for being able. And he was receptive to it. On the flip side, the people who should have been able to see everything, the Pharisees who knew the law backwards and forwards, who worked day and night to try and follow the law, who read in the law of a coming Messiah, who have seen countless prophets talk about it for thousands of years, how do they respond to this? They refused to see.
And then at no time did the blind man change his story or turn his back
Nope.
on being healed. At no time did he ever back down and say, well, I don't really know what happened. You know, he was not concerned about the fact that they wouldn't his parents for him. He was not concerned about the fact that you know, he was maybe thrown at the temple. He just stuck with what really happened. He told the truth the whole time.
Yep.
At no time did he ever turn his back on who they healed.
Absolutely. 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 I don't know that Nicodemus would be the only Pharisee, because we read at the end that there were some Pharisees that were still there with Jesus. So there were some, but it was something that I do think it's a gradual process. You know, we saw on Sunday night in John chapter 3. So we're not, or 6 chapters away, chronologically speaking. Seems to be maybe one of the first to go, but there's others that are sort of filing in, if we want to use that term there, as well. It would be hard to see these things keep happening and not believe. But sometimes we're hardened enough to see it happening. Have we ever heard the term stubborn as a mule? We can be that at times, right? We know we can see it literally happening in front of our face. It's not happening. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. We can relate to the Pharisees quite a bit. Go ahead.
John 12:42, 3 chapters after this. Nevertheless, even among many believed in Christ, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess it. A lot of movement changed.
Right.
One thing I want to bring up. There's a lot of people go to John chapter 9 there. In verse 31. Now we know that God does not hear sinners.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard preachers, I've heard people say that God don't hear anybody that's a sinner. Well, I don't believe that at all. This was a Jewish belief, okay? And this is from a man this is not a priest or a sent from God. This is a blind man.
Uh-huh.
That was just the common belief that God.
Sure.
And I've heard people say, well, sinners can't pray to God. You can't pencil Jesus into that.
Well, do we pray directly to God? How does prayer work? we pray through Jesus. Jesus is sort of the filing system, as it were, to get it to God, if you want to think about it like that. I'm glad that you mentioned that as well.
Someone was the worst sinner that's ever been a sinner in the entire world. They came and said, well, I said, you need to talk to God.
Mhm.
Pray to him tonight.
Mhm.
Pray to him right now.
Gotta-
And then start your journey.
Right.
And I'm calling God.
I agree. Let's take 3 things to go home with. First of all, faith. Yeah. Yeah.
This is my favorite because the little man is pitiful,
Right.
winds up completely healed, and he winds up sitting beside Jesus.
Sure.
It's just
It is. So first, faith is a growing process. And I want to mention something real quick. And if you've got your Bible, you can look at this and see. In verse 11, what did the man call Jesus? I want you only look at verse 11. What did the man call Jesus? A man. A man called Jesus. In verse 17, what does he call Jesus? He's a prophet. What does he say about Jesus in verses 35 through 38? Jesus was who? That's a arc of change, right? You know, sometimes we look at it this way and we think, well, Jesus is a man. Well, Jesus was a man just like me or you, right? But I know a lot of men and a lot of women, but I don't know them real well. But prophet moves him up a little bit, right? Well, people that I know a little better, I may know what their job is. I may know where they live. I may know how many kids they have. I may know where they went to school or whatever it might be. I know those people a little better than here. There are people that are up here that I know a lot about. And there are people up here that I love and care about more than anything in the world. And those are the people that I want to be the closest to. I'll hear, perhaps, that somebody passed away. And we can all relate. But we know that person's name. And you might say, I've heard the name, but I don't know anything really beyond that. But there might be somebody in that middle group that's like, oh yeah, they lived right down the street from Mom for 20 years. You know, he worked at ATR for 20 years. Or we know, it's like, I'll probably go to the funeral maybe for that person, if that, whatever the case would be. But there's this group up here that means more to us than anybody. I think we saw in this man that he went from, guy healed me. Y'all can fuss about him, but he seems pretty cool to me. To this man is the Son of God, and I'm going to hitch my ride with him the whole way. And I think we need to follow the same arc, because sometimes we sort of fall down that line just a little bit as well. But as long as we're sort of following the same arc as that man, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. I don't want to go with any more lessons. We'll go ahead to the end right there. But every time that we come together, we extend these invitations, and there may not be a single person that needs anything from this tonight, but I hope you've gained something from it. I know it was a longer lesson and we've went a little bit longer, but I hope we've gained a little something from it. And I hope that we'll put ourselves in the position of this man and see that it doesn't take much to get us sort of up to here, but we have to open our eyes. Not that we're legally blind, but sometimes we're spiritually blind, and sometimes we're blind by choice. And Jesus is the only remedy, the only doctor, the great physician who can help us see. If there's anything we can do for you, we always do invite you while we come to come, while we stand and sing.